Good morning. This is the third day of Passion Week. And on this day, Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives and began to speak of the prophetic signs that would occur related to his second coming. And in Matthew 24, he goes into great detail. I'm going to look at Luke 21. And just because of the time that we have, I'm just going to camp on one particular key verse. And it's Luke 21:24. He says here, speaking of the fall of Jerusalem, which was going to happen in 70 AD, an earlier prophecy that speaks of a later prophecy of his second coming, he says this, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. That's speaking of what would happen to the Jews after the Romans besieged Jerusalem. And from that point on, for the next 2,000 years, the Jews were spread out across the nations of the world. But this is the verse, the second half of verse 24, that I want to camp on this morning. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles. And you see that in 70 AD, until, and this is the key phrase, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Many Bible prophets, many Bible prophecies speak of this idea of the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. And then Jesus goes on to explain, when those days are fulfilled, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So I want to look at some statistics. I want to look at some history with Israel. I'm going to do part 1 this morning and then part 2 tomorrow morning. But here's the reality. The reality is that something really began to happen on May 14th, 1948. It was May 14th, 1948, the birthday of the founding of the nation of Israel in modern times, when Jews came from all over the world back to Israel. They came back to Israel, but they were surrounded by enemies. And they had a fight on their hands. I'm not going to go into the details. You can read about it in other histories. But at that point, Israel becomes a nation. But men and women, that is not when the times of the Gentiles had been fulfilled. Not at all. It was really only the beginning of what I believe was kind of like an end times clock. And we're living in that end times clock because so much has happened. There's 2 or 3 major issues that have occurred. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the founding of Israel leading up to the 1960s. And then tomorrow I'm going to go further. But from 1948 to 1967, Jerusalem was a divided city with Arabs and Jews separated basically by barbed wire and machine guns. In 1963, the Arab League had decided to introduce a new weapon against Israel called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And it was at that time that terrorist attacks began against Israel. In 1965, there were 35 raids by the PLO. In 1966, there were 41 attacks. In just the first 4 months of 1967, there were 37 attacks by the PLO, all targeting civilians. Nasser, the leader of Egypt, said, "We shall not enter Palestine with its soil covered in sand. We shall enter with its soil saturated in blood." Nasser expressed the Arabs' aspirations when he said, and I quote, "the full restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people. In other words, we aim at destruction of the state of Israel." And by June of 1967, the Syrians, Jordanians, and Egyptians had encircled Israel with soldiers, planes, and tanks preparing for an attack. The United Nations Emergency Force, which had been the buffer since 1956, suddenly backed out of Sinai. And at that point, President Johnson refused to help Israel. And in 1967, Israel stood alone. Nasser taunted Israel. "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel." and the Arab rhetoric was matched with the mobilization of Arab forces. 465,000 troops, more than 2,800 tanks, and 800 aircraft ringed Israel. But on June 5th, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike as their intelligence, the Mossad, picked up that all of the Arab nations surrounding Israel were about to attack. And at 7:14 a.m., the entire Israeli Air Force took off. Israel knew then where and how the Muslims were coming, and they struck first. Dangerously flying below the Russian-installed radar, almost touching the waves of the Mediterranean Ocean. With phenomenal speed, they struck the Egyptian airfields and destroyed roughly 300 aircraft while on the ground. They then struck the Jordanian and Syrian airfields and knocked out their entire air force before the pilots even had breakfast. At the end of the day, nearly the entire Egyptian and Jordanian air forces and half of the Syrians were completely destroyed. Then one of the great tank battles of modern times on the Sinai Peninsula took place. Most interesting stories that I've ever heard was the Egyptian tank officers coming into Israel about to attack, testifying of hearing noises that sounded like a huge tank force. And because of those noises, they literally abandoned their tanks and ran back to Egypt, and Israel won that desert battle. What was that? Many of us believe it was angels protecting Israel at that time. Israel then captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and then pushed Jordan back to the West Bank. Now listen to this. On June 7th, the order was given to recapture Jerusalem. Israeli paratroopers stormed the city and secured it. And at 9:50 a.m. on June the 7th, 1967, David Ben-Gurion announced to a stunned world, quote, "We are at the wall. We have taken control over Jerusalem." The IDF chaplain, Rabbi Shalom Goren, blew the shofar to celebrate. Some believe that that was the beginning of the end of the Gentile nations, that the times of the Gentiles was coming to an end. I believe that's one of the great signs. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to look at another great sign in modern history that I believe is showing us that we're increasingly coming closer to the coming of Christ.